Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Security is QA, my path from developer to pen tester. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I'll be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Joshua Barone, a SANS community instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Josh.
Thanks, Carol. So, like Carol said, my name is Joshua Barone. Talk is Security QA. Just to set some kind of expectations up front, this is not a super technical talk. This is mostly kind of like the philosophy of things I've learned over time in my career path and kind of walking that path. Before we jump into the actual talk, though, I do have kind of questions I want you to think about. And, so the first kind of question is like, are you the kind of person to ever taken apart something just because you wanted to see how it worked? You ever have that kind of desire to do that? Or maybe you've been on the internet looking at an application or thought, to yourself, wonder what would happen if I did this? What happens if I put this input or click this button or do something out of order? These questions I find are really kind of drivers for me personally in my life and how I approach things now, especially moving into the world of pen testing. So with that, just a little background on myself. So I'm a self-professed code monkey and security aficionado. So I've been in software development for well over 15 years now, across lots of languages, lots of frameworks, lots of different platforms, operating systems. And with that, lots of mistakes made and problems solved, coming back and fixing a lot of those mistakes, which is pretty awesome. I'm now moving into the world of web app pen testing, or I've been doing that for a little while. I'm a SANS community instructor, primarily doing the SANS 542 course, which is the web app pen testing course. I have my master's of science and computer science with a focus on information assurance and computer security. Several different certifications. I like all the letters after my name, so that's always fun. All right, so like I said, this talk is kind of the philosophy talk, really kind of laying out kind of the career path. And so I'm going to start with the early years. The early years really driven by kind of this notion, right? Curiosity killed the cat. But I'm a big believer in completing that statement, which is, satisfaction brought it back. I'm a very curious person. Whenever I see new technology, I really want to kind of rip it apart and understand how it works. So I've spent a lot of my career just trying to understand things under the hood. And as far as early years, I'm going to go way back into my early years. This guys, for anybody younger who doesn't know what this is the classic Nintendo Entertainment System. This was my first introduction to video game consoles. I was probably 7 or 8 when I first got one. And I have it in here because this is a very clear memory for me, because I remember sitting down as a kid in front of the TV and being utterly fascinated by the fact that I'm holding this little controller in my hand, I'm hitting buttons, and something is reacting on the TV screen and doing things that I tell it to do with those buttons. Like, it was just weird that I moved from just watching TV passively to now being actively engaged, all because of this little box. And it was just, just really piqued my curiosity, and I really wanted to understand it. And like I said, I have a very clear memory of my mother coming home and finding me in the living room with the Nintendo taken apart and the whole board exposed, and because I wanted to know why if I hit a button, things happened on the screen. Now, granted, because I was so young, I had no idea what I was looking at. And thankfully, I was smart enough to kind of keep track of everything. So I was able to put it back together without breaking it. So I didn't get into too much trouble. But it was kind of that start of revealing my inner hacker, was that particular memory, kind of revealing that I would go to great lengths to try and understand things, pull it apart, just to learn. Later on, the family got our first computer. My first computer was this. This is the Epson Equity 1. This was back in the days when Epson still made computers and not just printers. I had a uncle who introduced me to programming. But my first programming language was GW Basic, so I did a lot of text-based games. I also started sharing a lot of games with friends on our big 5.25-inch floppy disk, passing those back and forth. Like, hey, check out this game I've been working on, and trying to stump each other with puzzles. It was good times. This was where I started getting involved with like learning how you could hook the computer up to a modem and dial into BBSs, also known as bulletin board systems. That was kind of my first introduction. This was prior to the internet even being a thing. So that was another one of these layers where it was awesome that here it was, I'm sitting in front of this computer, and I actually had one of those coupler modems. So you actually took the handset of the phone and set it on this device, and then it would make a bunch of squeaky noises. And next thing I know, I'm able to type things on the computer and see people typing other things back. So I was able to actually have these communications and start learning from other people. Now, granted, I use mostly to play games online. Uh, on these bulletin board systems, but was also using it just to learn things. And I was also very interested because at this time too, I was also meeting people in the area who was running these bulletin board systems, trying to learn how they did it. I didn't have any of the funding to even begin to try and set up my own, so I never got that deep into it. But it was still pretty educational in the learning phase for me. Then I get to high school, and there was a handful of us that actually got picked by one of our teachers to help set up the computer lab in my high school. And that was pretty interesting because now I got to learn about networks. So we had probably 20 or 30 computers set up. We had a Novell server running that was kind of maintaining everything. So we were able to figure out how we could share information across all these computers and set it up so that if a user logs into one computer, they can still see files that they had loaded onto the server. So that was incredible, but of course, still a teenager. So we were trying to use the network for more than just that. We were slipping games into it. So Duke Nukem 3D and Doom we had installed and kind of hidden under layers of stuff so that our teacher wasn't kicking us back out on it. But this was also where I was introduced to game mods, which was pretty fun. I had some friends who were part of all this group. Uh, you know, the Doom screen there, we had the Barney mod. It was fun because it was just you replace a file and all of a sudden now things happen differently, right? We could change how the game was played. With Duke Nukem, I actually had a buddy who discovered that the sound clips, there were certain sound clips that I think you could just hit the function keys and like the character would say something to kind of taunt the other players. And he figured out that these were just little wave files on the computer. So he started recording his own and swapping them out. And we were utterly fascinated by that and started doing it back at him. And then, of course, next thing we know, the computer lab was a cacophony of expletives because we're teenage boys and it happens. And eventually, the teachers discovered the games on the system because of that, took them off, and we had to hang around for a month before we could load them back on. From there, moved into college. College for me was a pretty kind of rough start. I actually had no idea what I wanted to do with my career path or what to even study when I was leaving high school. I had a teacher who recommended that I start in engineering just because I had a pretty good, strong math background and science background. So I said, okay. And I remember I went and talked to the advisor and said, kind of like, what are my interests? And I told him I had a kind of a love for computers, wanted to kind of follow something along that path. The University of New Orleans down here at the time did not have a computer engineering curriculum, but they said that they had planned to start one. Kind of the way it was going to start was that you would have a heavy electrical engineering background, and then you would have some computer programming courses kind of on top of that, and some other circuit design specific stuff. So I said, okay. Took my first engineering course and absolutely hated it. It was not for me at all. No fun. Went back, talked to the advisor, said, look, this is not it. He said, well, just hang out, maybe start taking the first computer programming course, go see if this might be something you want to still consider. So I said, okay. I sat in my first computer programming course, and it was like, the heavens just opened up, the magic lights, shine down, angels singing. I'm like, this is what I was meant to do. This was just awesome because here I felt I could actually, found a home. Everything made sense to me. Like it was what I meant to do. So I wound up changing majors that semester, and haven't looked back since. But one of the interesting things was the education was really, really focused on problem solving. So a lot of computer science was all about kind of the science side of things. So design patterns and data structures and making things work correctly. Very functionality based. It was not security focused. So much so, I do remember sitting in a web app development course, kind of in the early days of web, and the teacher was teaching us kind of these programs that we were developing. And one of the aspects of this program was that we had like a search box. And in order to make the search box work, we literally had a string, so some characters, text that we're working with. And we built a query for the database, which was select this information from this table where the information that we're looking for is like this information provided by the user, and we just built the string by adding the user string to it, which if anybody has any kind of introduction to SQL injection, this is like classic SQL injection, and this is how we were being taught in the class. Now, to the college's credit, they don't do that anymore. They're much more security focused, but at the time, that was the education that I was getting, and I find that that's still some of the education that's coming out, where it's just kind of textbook, do these things, and it's function based, not security based. And while I was pursuing my bachelor's in college, I also wound up getting a job with a local firm. I started as a summer help desk intern, kind of worked my way into network admin, and was a network admin for the rest of my college career. When I graduated, I got changed to programmer with the same company. But I have this slide in here because a lot happened during this time. This actually covers a pretty good chunk of my path. But as that network admin, that help desk guy, I was dealing with the users of the network on just a daily basis, hourly basis, and saw, anybody who's worked help desk has all those wonderful horror stories, right? And I have my own fair share. I remember I had a user one time called the help desk to tell us that his cup holder was broken. And I'm like, why are you calling the computer help desk about your cup holder? Well, it turns out he was talking about his CD-ROM tray. It kind of looked like a cup holder back in those days, and he would literally go into his office every morning, kick it out, and then set his coffee cup on it because it was at the perfect height for him at his desk. And then at the end of the day, he would close the CD-ROM tray and go home. And because of that, the motor had burned out and it wouldn't open for him anymore. So he was calling us about that. So we had to teach him about, this is not your cup holder. And we had a lot of one of those wonderful horror stories. If you've ever watched the IT Crowd show, it very much got to that point where the phone would ring and it was almost an automatic response. Have you turned it off and back on again? Trying things out like that. But I bring this up to talk about this transition that happened when I graduated. I became a programmer, and all the stuff I kind of been talking about so far in these early years was really, I was a great representation of the people who are going to wind up using the software that I'm creating down the road as a developer. And for some reason, when I made this switch from network admin to programmer, I kind of forgot all of that. I kind of forgot about all the people I've been helping at the help desk. I kind of forgot about all the stuff that I was breaking and trying and messing with as a kid. And I kind of forgot all that stuff, unfortunately. So I kind of had to relearn all that moving into the programming world. And as a brand new CS grad, you kind of think you have all the answers, because I got my degree and, I've been taught these things. And then you sit down and start developing and you quickly learn you don't know anything yet, right? And that was kind of eye-opening. But in that programmer role, with that company, I was there for a few years and learned a lot. I was working with a lot of these people and quickly learning, like, I thought I knew the answers. I would write software, I turned it over, and they immediately come back and say it's broken. And turns out that what they told me what their requirements weren't what they really meant. Like, you had to read between the lines. So I had to start learning that process all over again as well. So lots of lessons learned there. So then kind of shifting gears. So I stayed in that role for a while, kind of learning, building as basic development goes. And then I changed job roles and was introduced to some serious growing pains. The first of which, this was my first large project that I got put on. This was as a software consulting role with a company. This was a very, very huge project. There was over 200 people involved between the developers, the architect, and the admins involved. 11 different consulting companies, all vying for bigger chunks of the contract, all that stuff going on. And I was put on the security team. Now, before this, I had started going back to school to work to my master's. This is where security was becoming a bigger part of my life because that was what I was starting to study. It was what I was becoming more interested in. So this was an awesome role for me. I was still like a mid-level, lower mid-level developer at the time, and this was incredibly eye-opening for me because now I'm part of the security team. This was a group of guys who all we were worried about was software security. So I was introduced to a lot of these terms that defense in depth and ABAC and just all the buzzwords. I was being part of that. ABAC, for people who don't know what that is, you might have heard of RBAC, which is role-based access control. ABAC is attribute-based access control, so it's kind of taking it to a whole nother level of granularity. So not only am I worried that the user has the right role, but I also worry what is the permission level of the information he's trying to access? Is it the right time of day for him to access it? All that stuff. We took all into that account, so it was really in depth. But in this project, this was also first time I really worked with a software architect who was an amazing architect, and he developed this whole ABAC system that we were going to use for security. And I remember sitting in meetings and he was explaining it to us, and it was just absolutely incredible to me. I could see how it could solve all kinds of problems for us on the security side. We sat down, we wrote an implementation, and we turned around to all the other developers and said, okay, this is what we're using for security. And all the developers pretty much went, nope, it's just way too complicated. And so we had to essentially kind of go back to the drawing board and reapproach how we were going to apply the system. We had to build all kinds of tooling around it to make it so that this whole project was a Java-based project. So we were using, I forget what they're called in Java. It was essentially like an annotation wrapper around the functions, so that they could easily just add this, one line thing on top of their function, and then security was automatically applied. So we had to develop that whole system just to make it so that the other developers would just start using this, and it would become actually being implemented, because otherwise it just wouldn't work. It was just way too complex and way too complicated. This was also learning some more secure coding practices. We spent a lot of time doing code reviews. I also started getting a little bit into kind of pen testing. We had a whole nother company who was just involved in the pen testing of the application, but I would like to pick their brain a lot, kind of learn how they're doing it. So I was kind of learning about the testing side of things. And then when I switched to my next role, which was as a senior dev, spent a lot of time on that side. When I moved to this dev role, this was a different project entirely. This was a little bit smaller team, smaller project. And this is where I really built into the idea of testing the software because we were extremely agile in our development. So we were doing those full releases every 2 weeks. And we were having a lot of issues where we're pushing out code that just didn't work or code that had bugs. So we started implementing a a lot of testing. I actually wound up building a whole testing framework around the unit testing engines and things like that we had in place to do large scale end-to-end testing with really easy scripts. And we also started doing unit testing for security. So this is where I started applying a lot of principles that I still use today, which was this idea of write small, test small. So the idea that, we had code where one function, one method would take up like 3 screens of text. Like you just had to keep scrolling. And it was just way too complicated of a method. Whereas when you break it down into little chunks of code that are easily read and easily understood, it's a lot easier to test those individual pieces. And it kind of builds into this Lego block idea that you build a bunch of small pieces that are easily testable, and you can kind of test for all the different variations of that method, and then you can build them together and trust that they're going to work. And then you can still test them as you build. And also that's where that testing at all layers. So testing at the individual functions, but also testing that when I combine multiple functions together, do they still produce the results I expect? And then the integration testing was the idea of this was using a Selenium framework. It was a way of kind of driving the web app for us. As we were doing all this testing and building this stuff out, I was finding some of these security vulnerabilities. So like the SQL injection, like I talked about before, or cross-site scripting. I'm sure everybody's heard of that one. That's kind of where the browser is doing stuff that it's not supposed to do. Like some code is running in users' browsers being served up from the server. So I actually built these integration tests for testing, and then also applied it for security, so that as I found these problems, I could write the test to reproduce the problem, and then hand it back to the developers who wrote that section, and then they could write their code and keep testing it until the problem went away. So that was pretty awesome. In this role is also where I found a love for educating. This was when I started doing code reviews and peer reviews, also doing some kind of one-on-one pair programming with junior devs, kind of talking them through the process as we were writing stuff. We did a lot of these what we call lunch and learn. So we would just take our lunch, we would order pizza for the whole dev team, and then throw up on a projector and get up there and talk about something that we were working on, whether it was this unit testing or maybe some web security vulnerability, what it is, how it works, how to stop it, that kind of thing. I found that when you try to teach something, it takes you to a whole nother level of understanding. You really have to take the time to fully understand it yourself before you can turn around and share that information with somebody else, especially when you're expecting to get questions about it. So this is the point in time when I really found that kind of learn it, teach it methodology. Sharing the information that you're learning really kind of helps build better aspects for getting that information across and getting it to stick to yourself as well. My next role was on a much smaller team, but a much larger project. And this was pretty interesting because this particular project was for a single client with a single web app, where the web app was the company. It was very important that this app work because this is the core of everything that they do. It had to be safe. It had to work. It had to be protected. Their whole investment is in this application, and so we as developers had to be very, very careful in making sure that we had it up and running. This was also even more so super rapid development. We were constantly building out new features because we started with nothing. We started from scratch for this company, and we just had to keep adding functionality to it because they couldn't really go live until we were done, or at least had it to a position where they could put it out there. So we were doing really fast agile development, really fast constant releases, and testing became more critical here than it had ever been in the past. Because of that super rapid development, we had to make sure that anything that we were touching brand new wasn't breaking anything that had already existed. because that would happen a lot. You would have a lot of situations where we realize, oh, we need to add this new column to the database, and all of a sudden everything is broken because that one column got added or changed or something like that. So we implemented a very strict testing policy. We had unit tests, integration tests, functional tests all over the board. This is also when I formally moved into more of a pen testing role. So actually testing the application, looking for security vulnerabilities towards the end of releases to verify that things were working as they should be, because we couldn't put anything out there that might blow back right away. We also had a lot of situations with people bypassing a lot of our protocols and then things blowing up and immediately having to go into like some incident response roles right away, which is never fun, but it was very educational. So we had to make sure that what we were building and what we were asking all the devs on the team to do was very simple, made sense, and it was something that they wanted to follow and would follow. It wasn't inhibiting them in any way. So we spent a lot of time making sure all that stuff was in place. We had all the tools and stuff provided to make sure that it was easy to actually follow along and build that out. So that's kind of where the path up to today that I've been building out. My current role as a developer, my current role is with Black Bag Technologies. So I'm developing digital forensic software. I spend a lot of time working with the code that we use to process forensic artifacts and things like that. And
did we lose Josh's audio, or is it just me?
It's just
you.
you.
Sorry, still live?
You're still good.
Okay, all right. So in my current role, like I said, building the software used to parse a lot of these digital forensic artifacts out of file systems and mobile devices and things like that. So the code itself has some new complexities to it that I haven't had to deal with a lot before, right? So not only does the code need to work, but it needs to fail gracefully, because not everything that you get to put into it is valid data. You might just have partial files and things like that. It also needs to protect itself because we're dealing with forensics. So, not everything is going to be good files, which means that lots and lots and lots of testing. There's lots of testing. There's lots of testing happening at all the layers. Because of the complexity of the software that we're writing, I'm very much applying that write small, test small philosophy to a lot of the code that I develop, because, understanding some of this stuff, these large chunks of methodology is really difficult. When you break it down, it becomes much more simple to learn. But I'm also a pen tester. So I'm a web app pen tester. So in this role, it's kind of interesting because of my career as a web app developer. I personally have made a lot of the mistakes that I look for in today's web apps that I'm testing. I also very much love this role because I'm constantly learning new things. I'm being introduced to new technologies all the time. I'm very much a big believer that, if you're not learning, you're not growing. And I'm constantly wanting to learn new things. And in this particular role, I find that it really kind of helps force me to always be introduced to new things, stretch myself, try things out. It's also in this role that I find, so in this role, I'm flashing back to kind of what I was talking about in that last growing pains role. So when I started pen testing with that group, trying to relate back to the developers, like here I was as a developer and tell them, look, I found a vulnerability, and immediately developers become very defensive. Developers very much have that, they have that sense of ownership of the code that they write. They feel very protective of it. And when you tell them it's broken or not good enough, they can be become very defensive about it and not actually hear what you're trying to tell them. So I take some of the lessons learned from that, especially in the current pen testing role that I'm doing, where it's, look, I've been there. I know it sucks to kind of hear that what you wrote isn't good enough. Um, I try very much to try and present it in such a way that I'm expressing that I'm here to help. I'm trying to help make your craft of development even better. We're trying to take it to another level. And very much when you do that, you cannot just be doom and gloom. You can't just say, here's everything that's wrong and walk away. You very much have to say, hey, look, you got your cross-site request forgery tokens in place. Everything is looking solid there. I tried all the SQL injections that I could think of, and nothing worked. Unfortunately, there was this one little spot where I think maybe we can just tweak it so that this cross-site scripting that I found won't work. And developers tend to be much more receptive when you approach it in a much more praising way. So I very much try to do that in my current role with when I'm presenting to the developers, and especially in the reports and things like that. They need to be tailored in such a way that, like, not saying that you're just broken and you didn't do anything right. It's very much we're just another arm trying to make this a better product and presenting it in that way.
Hey, Josh,
Yeah,
I got a question for you before you move on.
absolutely.
I see that you're about to do conclusion, but when you transitioned from a developer to more of a pen tester role, did you have any certs at the time? If yes, which ones got the attention of the security hiring managers? If no, do you feel like having them would have made things easier?
Yeah, so when I started making that transition was really in this particular project that I was talking about here. At the time, no, I did not have any pen testing specific certs. I think I had my SANS security essentials, the GSEC, as well as the certified incident handler, the GCIH, which had a little bit of a pen testing or had a bit of a web app pen testing protocol to it. But I didn't have any formal pen testing certs. I certainly didn't have my GWAP or anything yet. So I had to present that from this point of view, that it was really kind of taking testing, and I presented it more as functional testing, but on steroids, right? So one thing that we were testing here, most testing that happens is what developers kind of call happy path. It's we have this layout in mind. We think that, they go to this page, they click this button, they go to this page, they put the information here, and they test along this. Pen testing is just negative testing. It's testing what happens if I go to page 2 first instead of page 1. What happens if I put in something that you didn't expect? What happens if I put a number in a date field? What happens if I put, a name in a number field, something like that? So that's the way I presented it to the project manager, was that we needed to test for all the edge cases or common edge cases, and just kind of hid the pen testing under that guise of that. Um, in my current pen testing role, so that I got this role after having my web app pen testing cert. I'm specifically a web app pen tester. I don't do network pen testing, just because web app pen testing is kind of where my home is. It's the world I grew up in. It's the world I understand. So that's what I test and look for mostly. Sorry, what was the last half of the question, Jason?
The last half was, if not, do you feel like having them would have made things easier, having certs?
Yeah, so I think going back to trying to pitch doing that type of pen testing work, having a GWAP might have made it a little bit easier. It's saying, look, I have this education that says these things are real. Let's look for these things. Thankfully, I had a project manager who kind of trusted me, understood that I knew what I was talking about, and let me kind of run with it. But I can certainly see where in some other situations that may not have flown as easily. And I think having a certification might have helped with that. Yeah, absolutely.
I have a follow-up question. You said that you said things are real. In the developer world, do people not think pen test or hacking is possible when they're putting their code together?
So it depends on the developer, I'll be honest. So I've interacted with developers who understand that these things, need to be considered and coded for. I've worked with other developers, especially some of the more junior developers. Like I said, when I first came out of college, they kind of had that ego in there that I kind of knew what I was talking about. And some of these junior developers kind of look at the world, the modern development world, and there's all these frameworks and things like that now that hide a lot of this stuff. And so they don't even think it's even possible, not understanding that, a lot of these frameworks still give you ways to code around it and open yourself up to these vulnerabilities if you're not using secure coding practices. So yeah, so I mean, some of these developers just rely on other things to handle it and don't even consider trying to write more secure software.
What is the best way to communicate the value of QA skills to cyber leadership?
So yeah, kind of getting towards this conclusion role is that this was a Linus recently talked about this in one of his rants on the Linux mailing list. But this is kind of the whole takeaway from me through this process, that security problem is just a bug, right? Kind of talked about that testing the happy path versus the negative path. That software bugs, software vulnerabilities, and things like that is just a lack of quality. It's it's part of the quality review process to try and find these things and go fix them. So I think that if you can have your security department integrated, especially if you have a QA department, have those teams working together and communicating back to the developers, I think makes the software just that much better, right? It just, like I said, it's my role as a pen tester is just to help, take it up a notch, right? Make it more quality code that if you can present it in that way, makes a huge difference. That developers are craftsmen. Developers, their craft is software development. And if you can present it in such a way that you're just helping them make their craft better, it's much more well received and much more likely to not get the pushback and actually get solved. So that's very much a way of trying to present this as quality to security, and as security pitching it to quality.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Yeah, another question. For someone who has some pen testing certs, including the GWAP, but works in an organization where options for growing into pen testing is limited, what's a good avenue for moving full-time into pen testing?
Yeah, so that was kind of my problem. Like, I was a full-time developer who wanted to pen test. And the way I kind of approached that was that, kind of taking that approach of moving a little bit more to the QA testing side of things, but pitching it that I'm going to be the guy who's looking for the negative tests. I'm going to be the guy who's trying to break the software to make it better. That kind of gets your feet in the door, and they can kind of start seeing the benefit of that. And eventually I got to that position in that role where I was actually starting to apply that QA testing to other projects as well. So I was moving more into a pen testing role within the organization, which was pretty awesome. That would be kind of my recommendation, is to try and approach it that way. So as the developer, you kind of understand the code. You have the experience with the certs, you kind of have that knowledge, start getting your feet wet by doing more of that QA testing from the security perspective.
Thanks.
Yep.
Follow-up question, a different question. Is there a good reference for managers to better understand web app pen testing?
So I'm not a manager, so I haven't really stepped into that to really figure that one out. But I will say that really, when it comes to talking to managers, it's talking their language. So management has a different language than development or a pen tester. So you kind of need to know what their focus is, what their perspective is on things. So when you can talk about this pen test will help find the vulnerabilities before other people can find them and exploit them. You want to put that into a perspective of, what is the impact of somebody finding a vulnerability in the web app, right? Some monetary cost, public relations cost, right? What happens if somebody is able to change the logo on your website to the competitor's logo, right? Something like that. So putting it in that perspective can really drive home the importance of the security testing towards management when you put it in their language. So dollars, reputation, costs, things like that.
This is a question from Musa. Do you think experience trumps certs or education? And I know this is a very opinionated question, but what is your opinion?
So yeah, I would say experience can kind of trump that stuff, but in my opinion, education is a piece of experience. Not everybody has the drive to go teach themselves. I'm kind of a mixed person. I'm very much self-taught, but I've benefited a lot from my education background because I had some instructors who could point things and then I could run with it and dive deeper. Um, uh, Certs are proof of knowledge, in my opinion. They kind of like show that you have some experience with this. They can show your level of knowledge of this. So it's just a way of demonstrating that experience. I've also seen cases where I've talked to some developers who had 10 plus years of experience, but it was the same year over and over again because every year they changed jobs and they just kept doing the same job. There was no growth in that experience. Versus somebody who's done the same role for 10 years straight is going to have a much greater depth of experience. So it's kind of a weird mixed bag. But certainly, if I were hiring somebody and they could prove their experience but didn't have the certs, I would still hire them over somebody who didn't have the experience. That maybe just was really good at test taking and took the test, but couldn't really explain some of the concepts and have the experience to really dive deep. That might be a different case.
And then one more question, then we'll have you finish up, and then we'll do QA at the end.
Yep.
Do you believe a pen tester would make a good QA tester?
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Because pen testing is pen testing is really just trying to break things, throwing things at it. QA testing is an extra little role of trying to make sure that the software does what it's supposed to do or the application does what it's supposed to do, as well as not break when people are trying to test it.
Thanks, Josh. Go ahead and continue with your presentation.
All right. So, like I said, for me, this big takeaway from Linus kind of like hammers home this thought that's been kind of in the back of my mind for a while, which is that approaching this security is just an aspect of quality. So some of the big takeaways for me is learn the common security mistakes. So I'm a big fan of the OWASP top 10. Like I said, I'm a very big fan of share and teach what you learn. So if you learn a new concept, turn around and teach it. It's going to force you to really understand it at a different level. OWASP, if you're not familiar with that organization, it's the Open Web Application Security Project. They do a top 10. They just released a new one recently, kind of the top 10 vulnerabilities found in web applications, and not just what they are, how they work, and also how to mitigate them, which is pretty awesome. Great resource. I also think that you should practice hacking yourself. So even whether you are a developer, an admin, an architect, a pen tester, it doesn't matter. You should always be practicing. And I think you should be practicing and understanding the security side of things. So I'm a big fan of setting up little lab environments, getting yourself a copy of some virtual machine software, go download some vulnerable web apps, and just play with them. There's a lot of web applications out there that are purposely created just for these learning and testing and trying things out. I'm a big fan of those. Really helps drive home some of these concepts. So if you're a developer, something I want you to think about, code small, test small, think those little Lego blocks. It's much easier to test and understand what could break in small pieces of functionality rather than these really monolithic pieces of code. Also, test the negative. So don't just think about that happy path. Think about what could possibly be thrown at a function or input, and try all the things, right? Also, learn your tool. So like I had mentioned, that some of these frameworks have built-in protections, but you need to actually, in some cases, turn them on, or make sure you're not inadvertently bypassing those protections. Make sure you're using them to their utmost to help protect you. So learn and study your tools. For architects, like I mentioned, when that really large project that we had a great architectural design, but it was absolutely useless because it wasn't easy to implement. So devs saw the amount of work they had to do, and it was just like, no, it's not going to happen. So if you provide really good architecture, you also need to provide the tooling, code examples, anything to make the development easier. And the easier it is for a developer, the less pushback you're going to get in actually getting it implemented. So it's going to make it much easier to actually apply. Pen testers, out of the gate, you're testing the negative. That's your job. So you're going to throw everything at it. I do also think that especially if you're a web app pen tester, you need to learn how to code. You need to understand the amount of work that's actually being put in on the application that you're testing. It also will help you in writing and presenting the information back, because if you understand the code that's being written, you can actually kind of help point the developers into where the mitigations can actually be applied, or where you think it's breaking. The big thing, don't be adversarial. It is not an us versus them. We are, as a pen tester, you're helping to make the code better. You need to present it that way. You need to be part of the team in that way. You need to actually just kind of, make sure that it's not not being received that you're attacking the development, because otherwise they're not going to hear a word you say, and nothing will get changed. So resources, OWASP, I mentioned them. That's owasp.org. Go check out all their different tools and projects there. Great information. Website I found recently, this hacksplaining.com, especially if you're a developer, this is pretty awesome. It's kind of a vulnerable web app walkthrough that really explains in development terms how some of these hacks are happening. If you need to learn how to code, Codecademy, not Academy, but Academy with CAD. Great resources, good free resources to learn how to code. There's lots of vulnerable web apps out there. 4 that I kind of use as my go-to. Matilde by Jeremy Drew, and it's absolutely fantastic. And he actually just updated it with the 2017 OWASP Top 10, so it calls it out directly. The BWAP, it's a buggy web application. DVWA, which is the damn vulnerable web app. And then Tim Tones has his Pwned Hub, which is pretty fantastic as well. So that's it for me. I am always open to talk about this stuff, so feel free to hit me up on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle there. And yeah, Jason, any more questions?
Not at this time, but we'll give people a chance to ask a question here in a second. Someone did ask if you ever played Sega.
Played Sega?
Mm-hmm.
I had a... Yeah, so I played Sega with friends at their house. My family was kind of a Nintendo family growing up, so we only had Nintendo systems. But I did play Sega whenever I went to go visit friends. Mostly the Dreamcast, actually. We actually found some hacks for Dreamcast that were kind of fun. We wound up we actually turned a Dreamcast into a computer at one point. That was kind of fun.
That is fun. And I think one last question while I'm waiting to see if anyone else has any. Oh, here comes one. Any security frameworks for web app to recommend?
Security framework. So it really depends on the language that you're developing in. So it's kind of a hard one because there's so many different frameworks out there and so many different languages being developed all the time. I would say that, go check out the OWASP. They kind of have the security checklist, application checklist. Big fan of that. It's just covering all the bases. So making you kind of think about how are you handling user input? How is it being used in the server side code? Is it being sanitized and validated? Things like that. So outside of any formal programmatic framework, I would suggest at least that. And then just understand your tools, because like I said, most modern frameworks have all this stuff built in already.
All right. Another question from Drew. So you feel that introducing penetration testing to an existing and mature QA program will help developers accept the security findings at just another bug and avoid adversarial issues?
Yeah, I do. That was the way we kind of introduced the pen testing. When I first tried to be like, this was a pen test, it was a separate thing, it was presented as a security finding, made developers more defensive, versus where you can try to present it just as a QA bug. It's just like, instead of saying that here's cross-site scripting, you could say, input not validated properly. And it's a little bit easier to get accepted and get rolled in without triggering that adversarial instinct.
Thank you. Do you have a CTF that you recommend for beginners? And before you answer, I just want to let everyone know, visit holidayhackchallenge.com. holidayhackchallenge.com. That is the SANS CTF that we put out once a year. But which one do you have?
SANSHolidayHackChallenge.com. That's always my fun go-to. Yeah, Ed and his crew, they do a fantastic job with that one every year. The web app is always part of it. It's always my favorite part of it because I love to dig it. I always learn something new personally every year. And the way it's set up is that it's not just here's the challenge, go, but there's lots of resources to kind of learn and actually try and understand it and grow and solve the problem. Yeah, so that's my favorite one. As far as not necessarily CTF, but like I said, Matilde is one of my favorite vulnerable web apps. Jeremy Druin has done a fantastic job with that application. It breaks it down by each year's OWASP top 10. So you could actually go step in and you look at A1, which is injection, SQL injection or command injection. And there's different levels to it. So there's the completely vulnerable version of the web app, all the way up to the completely secure best practices applied. Good luck trying to break it. But it makes you think about the problem, and there's resources. He puts out YouTube videos with the attacks explaining exactly what's going on. I think it's a fantastic resource.
All right, Josh, any final words before we turn it over?
No, I just want to thank everybody. This is like I said, I love talking about this stuff. I'm pretty passionate about it, and any chance I get to share it, I'm always happy. So thank you to everybody to showing up, and thanks Jason and Carol for putting this on.
All right, Carol, it's all yours.
All right, well, thank you so much, Josh and Jason, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.